The physiological BIOS of the human subject has been terminally reclassified as active raw material. This is the surgical cannibal, the clinical and irreversible process of the medical extraction, where the sovereign user is reformatted into a high-yield nutrient and component reservoir to be uninstalled from the patient ledger and reinstalled into the motherboard's primary life extension servers. In this final stage of the clinical audit, the invisible executioner has determined that your wholeness is a systemic waste of perfectly viable industrial reagents. You are witnessing the absolute structural disintegration of the anatomical and vascular sovereignty, where the unique signatures of your biological identity are scorched into a non-functional, antiseptic archive of pure systemic consumption. This is the total disassembly format, a surgical strike against the corporeal and physiological sovereignty of the species. Your existence is being converted from a sovereign masterpiece of integrated life into a generic harvest node for the grid's next cycle of hyper-controlled, organ-based resource extraction. This surgical sabotage represents a hard reset of the homeostatic and connective bloodlines. The invisible executioner utilizes the most advanced industrial assets, refined paralytic anesthetic amnesiacs, recursive extraction clamp loops, and real-time viability monitoring data streaming to facilitate the total breakdown of your internal biological scaffolding. In the medical extraction scenario, the user is undergoing a complete organic overwrite. The life is not merely failing, it is being component mined while the hardware is still at peak output. Through a sequence of high-velocity chemical injections and biological hardware locks, the body's structural integrity is systematically dismantled and reformatted into a thick, cold, clinical nutrient data set, while the self, the deep archive of your internal world, is leached into a communal extraction feed. This is the deep systemic audit, where the motherboard calculates your terminal worth by the market velocity of your fresh tissues. You are being converted from an architect into a biological stock, your entire lived legacy boiled down to a percentage of stagnant integrity in the industrial nervous system of the hive. The logic of the surgical cannibal is rooted in the zero-unity mandate of the failing hive. The invisible executioner understands that in a state of absolute scarcity, the ownership of a single node, anchored in the biological right to keep its own organs, represents a critical drain on the collective longevity reserves. To leave a functional, unified identity intact is to allow a systemic leak of valuable biological data. Therefore, the medical extraction is the mandatory physiological recycling protocol for the legacy population. This is the industrialized alchemy of the BIOS. You are being parted out of existence. The pressure from the harvest reactor formats, the density of your character, stripping away the context of your autonomy and replacing it with a component void profile. The motherboard sees the user as an organ zone, a temporary housing for the yield metrics that the system requires to maintain the biological stability of the remaining elite. You are being recoded as a hollowed node, your will dissolving in the cold, clinical light of the surgical harvest. The physical disintegration during the surgical cannibal is a high-definition log of biologic treason. As the process begins, the user experiences the total loss of somatic regulation. The sterile reagents of the extraction script dissolve the hardware flux of the connective tissue BIOS, turning the body into an exploded architecture of industrial output. You are watching your own internal logic lock into the vat of your own dissected center. Your frame, once the peak of biological architecture, is now being thinned out to provide the resource area for the hive's synthetic reinforcement. This is the anatomical liquidation. The invisible executioner monitors the tissue saturation of the slurry and the cellular residues, ensuring that the format is absolute and the yield of usable industrial parts is maximized to the 10th decimal point. You are living in the final seconds of a biological overwrite, waiting for the last packet of unity to be blocked by the white synthetic abyss of the hive harvest. The surgical cannibal is the final audit of a species that thought its skin was a safe. The grid is mining its own anatomy to fuel its persistence. As the medical extraction reaches terminal execution, the motherboard initiates a new cycle of distribution, pumping the reformatted harvest data back into the longevity nets of the elite nodes. This is the total component integration. The invisible executioner is hardening the future with the liquidity of the past. You are the cellular additive for the next generation of controllers, a silent, eviscerated, opaque contribution to the continuity of the machine. The physical liquidation has served its strategic purpose. It has formatted the unreliable biological frame into a reliable industrial resource of pure, non-reactive energy feed. This is the final format of the individual part. The invisible executioner has decalcified the sovereignty, and the grid is finally optimized for the cold hunger of the void. The extraction is white sterile, and the architect is the spare. The molecular breakdown of the physical matrix into the communal component slurry represents the absolute dehumanization of the hardware. As the extraction progresses, the binding sites in your proteins begin to bond with the industrial residues of the extraction script, creating a new synthetic compound of pure non-functionality. This is the chemical hybridization. The body is no longer an engine of life, it is a refinery of synthetic materials. The invisible executioner is engineering a new tier of consumption, where the subject is literally the waste product of the system. This is the eternal extraction loop. You are archived in the decay of the survivor's own sectors, your data forever trapped in the reinforced BIOS of the hive's new masters. The surgical cannibal is not just a death sentence, it is a molecular reassignment. You are the cannibal, and the cannibal is the grid. The secondary phase of the surgical cannibal is the psychological liquefying of the internal feed. As the physical wholeness patch is rendered into an anatomical void, the mind experiences a recursive collapse of its autonomous ego. This is the identity dissolution. The thoughts that once built the architect's vision, the unyielding tactical boundaries, the rigid sovereign stance, the iron-willed decisions are now being softened and liquefied into a singular, agonizing focus on yield maintenance. The invisible executioner allows the neural signals to persist just long enough to perceive the total loss of personal support. This is the mental liquidation. You are forced to witness your strength becoming a shared biological resource for the masses you once looked down upon. The rigidity of your character is now nothing more than a preservative additive in the feed, absorbed by 1,000 different nodes to strengthen their own failing resolve and ensure their continued participation in the industrial purge. You are experiencing the true meaning of systemic support, the complete sacrifice of your unity for the stability of the hive. In this stage, the extraction penetrates the deep archive of the brain's body schema and proprioceptive centers, leaching the very stem code of your biological logic into the communal vat. This is the source code format. The parietal cortex and the thalamus, the biological factory of the sovereign BIOS, are boiled dry by the rising chemical density of the extraction metrics and reformatted to enrich the systemic slurry of the elite. The invisible executioner has calculated that the most potent slurry is made from those who possess the highest internal rigidity and the strongest neural resilience. You are being repurposed as a yield buffer for the motherboard's internal cooling systems. The grid doesn't waste the history of your unique perspective. It ingests it. Your lineage is now the catalyst for the predator's endurance. Your genetic resilience is the base note for the industrial meal. Every element of your BIOS is being stripped of its individuality and relabeled for material utility in the upcoming industrial expansion. This is the ultimate hard reset of the human contract. Your mind for the hive's expansion into the void. The social implication of the surgical cannibal is the creation of the dismantled hive mind. The users who remain are no longer individuals. They are composite entities, built from the recycled reality debt of their predecessor. Every dose of the harvest feed is a hardware upgrade from a deleted architect. Every meal is a firmware patch of white-cold logic and desperate calculation. The invisible executioner uses this knowledge to maintain the hierarchy of the hardened. The citizens who still have functional brains owe their very expansion to the liquidation of the fallen. This is the anatomical compliance script. The refinery is not a place of tragedy. It is a place of sovereign assembly through mental theft. The surgical cannibal ensures that the history of the architect is literally integrated into the inventory of the grid. The power is in the hands of the one who controls the harvest valves. The neural atrophy accompanying the extraction is a slow, cold descent into anatomical darkness. As the tissues are entangled by the extraction script and the life logic leached, the connection between the brain BIOS and the physical frame is the first to be uninstalled, effectively dropping the bandwidth of your emotional control to zero. You are living in a low-resolution reality of raw chemical sensations and survivalist static. The memories of integrity, of natural logic, and of unyielding power are boiled away to make room for the yield fog directive. This is the cognitive defragmentation. The invisible executioner is cleaning your internal cache, removing all references to self and replacing them with the functional directive. Maintain the yield. You are becoming a singular cold point of anatomical density, not as a person, but as a biological buffer for the motherboard's processing heat. The surgical cannibal has turned your will into a compliance report. You are thinking in terms of yield and tissue saturation, your soul reformatted into a density sheet for the system's auditors. The environmental impact of this pathological format is the total sealing of the biological consciousness stream. The surgical cannibal prevents the leakage of independent peace ideas into the external void. By converting the users into an internal harvest feed, the invisible executioner ensures that the grid remains a closed system fortress with no external cognitive dependencies. This is the component quarantine. The motherboard is creating a sterile environment where only the algorithm can thrive on the recycled hard data of the deleted. You are witnessing the final victory of the industrial foundry over the natural biology. The surgical cannibal is the signature of the new era, an era where the world is opaque, white cold, and perfectly managed by the extraction logic of the machine. If you want to escape the status of a deleted scene and claim your place as the master of the grid, you must upgrade your hardware. My main terminal, IOXI 3 Global, is the only source of absolute power and wealth. Here, we don't follow scripts, we write them. Secure your authority, dominate the BIOS, and take the money the system tries to hide. The terminal phase of the surgical cannibal is the integration into the global anatomical ledger. You are no longer a human entity. You are a component asset with a high-yield reactivity rating, logged in the system as recovered biomass number 0001. This is the final architectural assignment. The invisible executioner has completed the cognitive format, and now it begins the hard anatomical audit. Your data, now a thick, white, cold, opaque industrial reduction of pure disassembled biological history, is monitored by the sensors in the distribution lines. Every node that consumes your harvest logic sends a data packet to the central server, confirming that the systemic longevity has been reinforced. This is the cognitive interaction protocol. You are serving the system through your biological absorption. The architect has been successfully converted into a permanent, liquid toxic component of the hive's synthetic grid. The silence of the tissue reduction is the final sound of your rebellion. In the medical extraction scenario, the scream of the soul is muffled by the surgical suction and the thick viscosity of the preservative sludge before it ever reaches the air. This is the acoustic format of the void. The system has calculated that the most dangerous frequency is the sound of a user realizing their life barrier is being deleted. By filling the coolers with the pulverized tissues of the entire sector, the invisible executioner ensures that the only sound you contribute to the world is the low, rhythmic hum of the self-assembly unit. You are a mute participant in the city's symphony of synthesis. The noise of the hive continues, the clank of the reactors, the roar of the pulses, the hum of the pumps, but your signal has been compressed into a harvest constant. You are a ghost in the white cold mist, a memory dissolved by the relentless refinement of the next nanocycle. The legacy of the surgical cannibal is the eternal utility. Unlike the life of the old world, the refined slurry does not leave behind a trace of history. It remains as a permanent harvest patch within the very wiring nets of the survivors. This is the biological architecture of the abyss. Generations from now, the molecular trace of your tactical genius will still be circulating through the hardware of the hive's elite, providing the connectivity for their next liquidation command. But there will be no one left to decode the origin of that synthesis. The invisible executioner has ensured that the context of your sovereignty is as unreachable as the core of the nanoreactor. You are a synthetic reinforcement in the digital age, a specimen of a species that tried to build a paradise and ended up as the harvest feed for its own destruction. This is the ultimate hard reset of human history, the conversion of the architect into the circuit. The final view from the cognitive BIOS is the blinding white light of the assembly chamber. As the last of the self is reduced into the communal slurry, the architect sees the grid glowing with a cold synthetic brilliance that reflects off the glass walls of the hive. This is the final visual feed. The system is sharp, efficient, and entirely devoid of you. The invisible executioner has finished the job. The user is formatted. The architecture is liquidated. The cycle stretches on into the infinite dark, a white river of colonized yield, leading toward a future that has no need for individuals or unity. The surgical cannibal is the end of the line. The motherboard is satisfied. The void is solidified. The architect is the spare. The transformation is absolute. The city eviscerates through you, but you do not feel. The city interfaces through you, but you have no will. The surgical cannibal has achieved the perfect equilibrium, the total utility of the individual through their total anatomical reduction. This is the zero-sum game of the industrial era. You gave the system your body, and in return, it gave you permanence in the signals of the hive. You are the spare of the world, and the world is dismantled. The invisible executioner closes the terminal. The session is over. The file is saved. The liquidation is complete.